Happy New Year, and this is the third of our first story for 2026. Santino's story and his struggles to give his family safety in an unforgiving world. Now overrun by a virus that he helped spread. With preparations starting, hopefully they all could escape without any problems. Chapter 13, The Stalemate. The executioner did not attack. It did not descend. It became a permanent feature of the eastern ridge, a dark sentinel against the sky. It moved only to switch observation points, vanishing for hours only to reappear on a different outcrop, its gaze always fixed on the valley. It was studying them, learning their patterns, their numbers, the rhythm of their guard shifts. The mountain's peace was now the peace of a mouse who has seen the owl's shadow. Life in the valley became a nerve-shredding exercise in measured routine. The mountain community's ancestral traps were useless. This was not a mindless chaser stumbling through the bamboo. Their water runs to the spring, their foraging in the terraces, all were conducted under the feeling of those distant, calculating eyes. Santino's wound, which had settled into a dull ache, began to burn again with a low-grade fever. Stress. Weakness. Dr. Anj monitored him relentlessly, her own anxiety a mirror to his own. "It's waiting for something," Corporal Reyes concluded, marking the creature's positions on a hand-drawn map. "It's not a siege engine. It's a scout. It's assessing the target's strength, habits, vulnerabilities. It's gathering data to send back." "Send back to what?" Benjo grumbled. "The foreman's busy building his kingdom. You think it cares about us that much?" "It cares about efficiency," Kaito said, his eyes haunted. "We're an anomaly. A variable it didn't account for. We stole from it, we evaded it. We're a bug in its code. This," he pointed at the ridge, "is the debugger. It's here to study the bug before erasing it." Apo Sila and her people grew restless. Santino's group had brought this silent predator to their doorstep. The unspoken accusation hung in the air. The trade for medicine no longer seemed fair. The tension broke not with an attack from the ridge, but with a tremor from the south. It began as a low, constant vibration in the ground, felt through the soles of their feet. Then, late one afternoon, the southern horizon lit up, not with the orange of a single fire, but with dozens of scattered, sudden flashes, muted, distant booms following seconds later. It looked less like a battle and more like a widespread, violent geological event. The radio, perpetually scanning, caught the chaotic fringe of it. "Fall back? Fall back to the river. They're not holding the line there." Gunfire, screams, a sound like tearing metal. "The big one's engaged. It's the one from the city. There, God, they're tearing each other." The transmission dissolved into a roar of static and a new, horrific sound, a deep, grinding screech, like two mountains being forced to mate. "All stations, all survivors, avoid the San Miguel Tarlac corridor. Repeat, avoid. It's a war zone between the evolved. They're consuming each other." The voice cut off. Apo Sila listened to the crackling static, her face etched with a deep, ancestral understanding. "The Tubawea," she said. "They have met. The pond is too small." The implications crashed over Santino's group. The foreman and the sergeant were at war. This was no longer about humans. This was VA against VA, a brutal contest for territory, biomass, and evolutionary supremacy. The distant flashes were titans clashing. The tremors were their footsteps. For 3 days, the distant thunder continued. The executioner on the ridge watched the south as much as it watched the valley. On the 4th morning, it was gone. Relief was immediate and palpable. People breathed easier. Children were allowed to play near the stream again. But Santino, Reyes, and Dr. Anj felt no relief. The void on the ridge was more ominous than the presence. "It was recalled," Reyes stated. "The foreman is committing its specialized assets to the front line. We are no longer a priority." "Or," Dr. Anj countered, her voice quiet, "it gathered all the data it needed." The answer came not from the ridge, but from the mountains themselves. 2 days after the executioner vanished, the first refugees arrived. Not human refugees. It was Kaito on perimeter watch who raised the alarm. Movement on the lower game trails. Not the careful, observing movement of the hunter. This was a desperate, scrambling flight. A group of a dozen infected, a mix of types, burst from the treeline at the valley's southern entrance. There were 2 basic chasers, 3 prowlers missing limbs, a spitter dragging a ruined, corroded leg, and others too damaged to classify. They were not attacking. They were fleeing. Behind them, coming up the trail with a terrifying, relentless pace, was a new creature. It was smaller than the sergeant, but denser, a compact engine of destruction. Its skin was a patchwork of hardened calluses and metallic shards, scrap armor fused into its flesh. One of its arms ended in a massive, bony hammerhead. The other was a cluster of sharp, probing spikes. It moved with a single-minded fury, not hunting for food, but culling. It was a reaper, a variant born not for hunting humans, but for disassembling other infected. The foreman's frontline infantry in the war against the sergeant. The reaper slammed into the fleeing pack. The bony hammer fell, crushing a prowler's skull with shocking efficiency. The spike arm lashed out, impaling a chaser. It was a brutal, efficient slaughter. It wasn't eating the kills. It was systematically destroying them, reducing rival biomass to inert waste. The mountain community's traps, designed for luring and killing, were useless against this wave of panicked fugitives and their puritanical executioner. The reaper finished its grisly work at the valley entrance, standing amidst the twitching corpses. It raised its head, sniffed the air thick with the scent of fresh human fear, water, and green things. It took a step toward the terraces. Then it stopped. It tilted its head, as if listening to a distant command. With a last, grating growl, it turned and shambled back down the trail, leaving the carnage behind. Recalled to the front. The valley was not a strategic objective. It was a sideshow. The silence that followed was deafening. The two groups of survivors, the lowlanders and the mountain people, stared at the scene of brutal, non-human warfare. Aposila broke the silence. "The spirits of the mountain are strong," she said, but her voice lacked its former conviction. "But they cannot fight a war between gods. This valley is a cleft in the rock. For now, the war flows around it. But when one Bawea eats the other, it will be bigger. And hungrier. And it will remember every crevice where scraps might hide." Santino looked from the dead infected to his daughter's pale face, to the worried faces of his group, to the southern horizon where the fate of the new world was being decided in a clash of monsters they had helped create. The stalemate was over. They were not being hunted. They were being ignored. And in this new world, to be ignored was a temporary blessing and a promise of a far more terrible attention to come. Their seeding ground was safe only for as long as the giants were busy fighting. And everyone knew in their bones that the fight would not last forever. Chapter 14. The Calm Between Storms. The Reaper's departure left a chilling lesson scrawled across the valley's entrance in viscera and silence. The rules had changed again. The Sibyl Codex, their Bible of survival, was missing a whole New Testament. The war to the south wasn't just background noise. It was a living laboratory of the virus's ultimate capabilities and perhaps its limits. "We need to see," Corporal Reyes said, his voice low and intent in the council of leaders, Santino, Benjo, Dr. A&J, Kaito, and Aposila. "Not with our ears on a radio. With our eyes. If one of those things kills the other, we need to know how." "It is madness to go towards the fire," Aposila warned, but even her voice held a note of grim curiosity. The ancestral wisdom spoke of observing predators to avoid them, but these were predators of a scale her people's stories never contained. "It's the only fire that matters now," Santino said, the weight of the galaxy blue sticker forever in his pocket. He was the vector, the unwitting architect. He needed to see what his world had built. "We don't go to the battlefield. We find a vantage point. We watch from the last row of the theater." The plan was reckless, but it was their first proactive decision in weeks. A small, fast team. Reyes for tactical analysis, Kaito for observation and recording, Benjo for security. Santino would drive Sandata, the more agile and armed jeepney. They would go to the highest ridge southwest of the valley, overlooking the vast central plain where the radio chatter placed the epicenter of the clash. They left at first light. The drive was a tense journey through a landscape holding its breath. They saw evidence of the war's periphery, trees sheared off halfway up, fields churned into mud by the passage of something massive, and the occasional, lonely body of a specialized infected. A spitter caught in a collapsed trench, a prowler snapped over a fallen log. All dead from trauma, not gunfire. From their vantage point, a jagged spine of rock, the scale of the conflict unfolded through binoculars and Kaito's telescopic camera lens. 10 kilometers away, the plain was a swirling, chaotic melee. It was not a battle line. It was a biological storm front. At its heart were two moving mountains of flesh and innovation. The Foreman's Legion was a wave of terrifying diversity. They saw squat, armored crushers that moved like living battering rams, gliding harriers that launched from high ground to land amidst the enemy, swarms of small, fast rippers that targeted joints and sensory organs. The sergeant's forces were fewer, but brutally uniform. They moved in phalanxes of the same ceramic-plated infantry they'd seen at Camp Tala, wading into the diversity with disciplined, synchronized pushes. They had their own specialists, long-limbed punchers that targeted the Crusher's legs, and stationary, pulsating weavers that seemed to spin thick, glue-like strands to trap the Harriers. And in the center, the Titans clashed. The foreman had grown. It was now a grotesque cathedral of biomass, incorporating girders, vehicle parts, and the fused bodies of lesser infected into a towering, multi-limbed form. It fought with terrible, creative brutality, using a crane arm fused to its spine to swing a wrecking ball of concrete and rebar. The sergeant was its mirror opposite, a dense, low-slung fortress of military-grade adaptations. Its armor was layered and angled, deflecting the foreman's blows. It fought with shocking precision, using a massive, bone-derived piledriver fist to target specific structural weak points in the foreman's conglomerate body with methodical, hydraulic force. "It's not a fight to eat," Reyes whispered, dictating notes for the codex. "It's a fight to disassemble. The sergeant isn't trying to kill the foreman. It's trying to take it apart into usable components." As they watched, a familiar, lean shape darted through the chaos with lethal grace. The executioner. It was targeting the sergeant's specialized units, leaping onto a weaver's back, its scythe-like claws finding seams in the ceramic plating with uncanny accuracy. It was the foreman's surgeon, removing key organs from the enemy's body. For a moment, it was a masterpiece of predatory efficiency. Then the sergeant reacted. A command seemed to ripple through its forces. Two punchers broke off and, with coordinated, piston-like blows, drove the executioner towards a waiting phalanx of standard infantry. The infantry didn't try to bite or claw. They grappled. They piled onto the hunter, using their sheer weight and numbers to immobilize it. The executioner thrashed, disemboweling 2-3 of them, but it was like a razor blade caught in a rug. Then a crusher from the foreman's side, blind with rage or perhaps directed, charged through the melee. Its target was the phalanx, but in its trampling charge, it crushed the pile of struggling bodies, infantry and executioner alike, into a pulp of splintered bone and fluid. The hunter was gone. Erased not by a superior hunter, but as collateral damage in a war of giants. Kaido caught it all on the camera's burst mode. "It's expendable," he breathed, horrified. "Even that, the ultimate specialist, just a tool to be used and broken." The battle raged for hours. They saw the foreman's creative brutality slowly overwhelmed by the sergeant's relentless, grinding efficiency. The foreman's strength was its diversity, but in a direct, set-piece confrontation, the sergeant's unified doctrine and hardened adaptations proved superior. One of the foreman's major limbs, a composite of crane and human muscle, was torn clean off by the sergeant's piledriver fist. The foreman let out a seismic roar of what could only be interpreted as frustrated rage and began a staggered, terrible retreat, its legion dissolving into a chaotic scramble south, harried by the sergeant's advancing, orderly lines. The sergeant did not pursue far. It consolidated its forces on the plain, standing amidst the wreckage of its rival. Then, it began the systematic process Reyes had named, disassembly. Its forces started breaking down the foreman's slain giants, the broken crushers and harriers, carrying chunks of biomass back towards its own territory. "It's not claiming territory," Dr. ANJ said over the radio, listening to their report. "It's claiming the raw genetic and material data. It's learning from the foreman's adaptations by digesting them." The team returned to the valley as night fell, shrouded in the profound silence that follows an earth-shaking event. They were covered in the dust of the distant cataclysm, and their eyes held the glazed shock of witnesses to a new genesis. That night, by a shielded fire, they updated the Sybil Codex. The new pages, filled with Kaido's photos and Reyes's tactical notes, were titled, "Observation, Apex Conflict. Hypothesis confirmed. VA strains are competitively speciated. No central hive. Rival monarchs vie for dominance. Critical weakness revealed. Monarchs are tactical, not omnipotent. Their control is local. Destroying them appears to cause strategic collapse and disarray in their specialized strains. C. Executioner loss leading to foreman's surgical deficit. Adaptation tiers observed. Tier 1, chasers, etc. environmental/gross resource. Tier 2, spitters, prowlers, etc. tactical/problem solving. Tier 3, reapers, crushers, strategic/warfare specialists. Tier 4, monarchs, directive/doctrinal. The source of localized evolutionary pressure. Rule 8. In a conflict between monarchs, all lesser variants are expendable ammunition. Their complexity does not grant them safety. Rule 9. Victory goes not to the most creative, but to the most efficiently integrated system. Diversity without unity fails against focused, unified adaptation. Santino stared at the new rules. The foreman, the king of Manila, the beast that had haunted his dreams, was broken. Beaten not by humanity, but by a rival monster. There was no victory in it, only a terrifying transfer of power. The sergeant now ruled from the ruins of Camp Tala to the outskirts of Manila. It was smarter, more disciplined, and now fattened on the biomatter and innovations of its rival. It was a colder, more calculating threat. But they had also seen a crack in the invincibility. Monarchs could be hurt. They could be made to retreat. They could be killed. And if a rival virus strain could do it, perhaps with the right knowledge, the right tools, and a strike at the perfect moment, so could they. The sound that broke the night's silence was not from the south. It was from the north. A deep, rhythmic, and unmistakable thump-thump-thump of rotor blades. Not a lone, fleeing helicopter. This was the heavy, deliberate beat of a Chinook, and it was getting louder. Searchlights, like cold, probing fingers, swept across the mountain peaks to the north, methodically searching the valleys. The giants had finished their fight, and now, the world that had been watching from the shadows beyond the war zone was making its move. Their fragile seeding ground was no longer hidden. It was illuminated. Chapter 15. The Probing Finger. The Chinook was a ghost from the old world, but its intent was purely of the new one. It didn't broadcast reassuring messages. It didn't land. It circled their valley for 20 precise minutes, its searchlights dissecting the terraces, the lodge, the parked convoy with clinical detachment. Through binoculars, they could see figures in dark, non-standard uniforms leaning out of the open ramp, not with weapons pointed, but with sensor packages and cameras. They were mapping, scanning, assessing biomass, heat signatures, and likely structural integrity. Then, as suddenly as it came, it powered north, its thumping rotors fading into the mountain night. It left behind a deeper silence and a new, chilling entry for the codex. Observation, external actor, designation, Scanhawk. Profile, private/state remnant. Objective, intelligence gathering, resource assessment. Not rescue. Tactical note, technological threat. Capable of rapid insertion/extraction. Unknown alignment. Assume hostile by default. Their interests will not align with survival of small, non-aligned groups. They weren't looking for people, Corporal Reyes concluded, his face grim in the firelight. They were doing a resource survey, checking the lay of the land, counting heads, assessing defenses. We're not survivors to them. We're either assets, obstacles, or test subjects. The mountain community was terrified. Aposila saw it as a second metal plague. First the sickness from the earth. Now the sickness from the sky. They will take what they want and leave dust. Santino's mind, however, was spinning with the user's devastatingly sharp insight. The sergeant had won the battle, but at a cost. It had expended specialized units. It now held territory, but the north was lean biomass compared to the protein-rich megacity the foreman still held. The sergeant was a disciplined warlord on a scarce diet. The PMC, they were a walking, talking, heavily armed supply drop. If that bird is based nearby, Santino said slowly, they have fuel, ammo, metals, electronics, and people. Trained people. For a virus that adapts by consuming and repurposing, a PMC base isn't a threat. It's a 5-star buffet. Dr. ANJ nodded, her scientific horror mingling with the logic. The sergeant's adaptations are military grade. It defeated the foreman through integration and discipline. Imagine what it could integrate if it assimilated modern military hardware, tactics, and brains. Kaido looked ill. So we either get harvested by the PMC for whatever they want, or we become the cheese in a trap when the sergeant comes to eat them. A bitter plan, the only kind left, began to form. They couldn't fight the sergeant. They couldn't trust the PMC. But they could observe, predict, and hide in the blind spot of a larger conflict. They spent the next 2 days in frantic, camouflaged preparation. They moved the vehicles under thick canopies, draped nets woven with local foliage over the lodges, and masked their heat signatures by only cooking in deep, shielded pits during specific temperature inversions. They became ghosts in their own refuge. Their vigilance was rewarded. The Scanhawk returned, this time with a smaller, faster bird, a black, unmarked helicopter. It descended near a relatively clear area on the northern ridge of the valley. A 6-man team in sleek, gray combat armor deployed. They moved with a professional, quiet efficiency that was alien after the brutal biology of the infected. They left a device, a tall, slender pole with a complex array of sensors and a quiet, blinking light, planted in the ground. A long-range surveillance post. Then they lifted off, leaving their mechanical eye behind. "They're staking a claim," Benjo muttered, marking the valley on their map. Reyes studied the post through a scope. Motion, sound, thermal, probably seismic. "They'll know everything that moves here. We're in a zoo." But the sergeant's intelligence network was biological, and just as perceptive. The next morning, a Reaper, the same model they'd seen culling the fleeing infected, was found dead at the base of the northern ridge. It hadn't been crushed in battle. It had been taken apart. Its hammer arm was severed with precise, powerful cuts. Its sensor-rich head was missing. It had been scavenged not by animals, but by something that knew what it was looking for. The sergeant was aware of the new player, and it was studying them back. The stalemate had become a three-way Cold War: the hidden survivors, the high-tech PMC, and the adaptive biological kingdom. Each was observing the others, assessing threats and opportunities. The break came from an unexpected source. A ragged, half-dead man stumbled into one of the mountain community's outermost traps. He wasn't infected. He was a PMC deserter. His name was Jax, and he was a former logistics tech for Aegis Solutions, the private military company operating out of a fortified sea base near Subic Bay. "They're not here to save anyone," Jax coughed, sipping precious water. "Command's directive is acquisition and containment. Acquisition of viable genetic material from the evolved infected. Containment of useful survivor populations for labor and testing. They see the virus as the next frontier of bioweapons. They want to control a monarch." He confirmed their worst fears. The Scanhawk survey had categorized their valley as Site Gamma, low-yield survivor enclave, potential observation post for northern VA strain activity. They were not targets for rescue, but for future asset stripping. "But the sergeant, it's not playing," Jax whispered, fear in his eyes. "We lost a scout team to a new variant last week. Big, quiet, with skin that diffused thermal scans. It didn't just kill them. It patterned them. Studied their gear, their formation, before it crushed them. Our captain thinks we're hunting it. He's wrong. It's reverse engineering us." The user's vision was unfolding perfectly. The PMC wasn't just a new actor. They were the catalyst for the virus's next evolutionary leap. The sergeant, the disciplined warlord, was about to be infused with cutting-edge technology and tactics. Santino made a decision. They would use the PMC's own surveillance against them. They would feed the sensor post just enough data, evidence of their own poverty, their lack of threat, to be deemed low-yield, unworthy of immediate attention. At the same time, they would use Jax's knowledge to monitor Aegis's communications, to watch as the sergeant inevitably turned the hunters into the hunted. As they integrated Jax and his terrifying intel into their plans, a new transmission was picked up, not from Aegis, but from the far south, on an old emergency frequency. It was weak, riddled with static, but the voice was chillingly familiar, a distorted, guttural echo of the charismatic fast food CEO from the Taste the Future ads. "Adaptation is perpetual. The First Kingdom faltered. A new synthesis is required. The material from the sky will be assimilated. The cycle continues." The foreman was not dead. It was broadcasting, learning, and it had just identified the same opportunity as the sergeant. The valley was no longer a hiding place. It was the quiet eye at the center of a gathering storm, where two biological empires and the last gasp of human militarism were on a collision course. Santino and his seeds were planted right in the middle. Their survival would depend on knowing exactly when to burrow deeper, and when to risk pushing a leaf toward the sun. Chapter 16, The Gathering Storm. The intelligence from Jax was a map of the coming tempest, but as Santino studied it, he saw not a path for escape, but the shape of a possible shelter. The three giants, the sergeant, the foreman, and Aegis Solutions, were circling, their attention fixed on each other's throats and the rich prizes they represented. "They don't see us," Santino said, standing before the group in the central lodge. He pointed to Jax's notes, to the surveillance reports. To Aegis, we're a low-yield enclave. To the sergeant, we're an irrelevant pocket of biomass, less than a rounding error compared to a PMC base. To the foreman, we're a speck behind the wall of its real enemy. We are not a target. We are terrain. Benjo shook his head. Terrain gets trampled in a war. Not if it's a rock, Santino countered, a new steel in his voice. The delivery driver was gone, replaced by a man reading a different kind of map. We've been thinking like prey, running, hiding. But the storm isn't chasing us. It's passing by. Our valley isn't in the path of the lightning. It's in the eye. And the eye only moves if the storm does. He laid out his vision. The sergeant and the foreman were locked in a strategic stalemate. The sergeant had the discipline and the defensive position in the north, but lacked the vast biomass of Manila. The foreman had the numbers and the ruthless creativity, but had been bloodied. Their conflict would be a grinding war of attrition, focused on key resources, like the technology and material of Aegis. They would bash against each other, again and again, right on their doorstep. So we let them, Santino said. We fortify this rock. We use the debris from their war to make ourselves harder. We scavenge what they leave behind. Guns from dead PMC soldiers. Metal from wrecked vehicles. Tools. Generators. Every piece we add makes us less like soft terrain and more like a fortress they'd have to waste precious energy to break. And neither of them can afford to waste energy on us while the other exists. It was a staggering shift in perspective, from fugitives to settlers, from a seed hiding from the fire to a sapling using the burnt soil to grow. Aposila was the first to agree, her eyes sharp. The mountain does not flee from two fighting Calabaw, water buffaloes. It lets them wear themselves out against its slopes. Then it takes their bones for fertilizer. The plan coalesced with a purpose they hadn't felt since leaving Manila. They would not run. They would not lure the storm. They would harden their ground. Phase 1, the scavengers. While Aegis launched its Operation Silver Sample, they didn't watch idly. They observed. They noted the landing zones, the patrol routes. The moment the battle in the Box Canyon drew the attention of the VA forces, and the main Aegis elements, small, silent teams, led by Benjo and Reyes, slipped out. They didn't go to the canyon. They went to the flanks, where Aegis had staged equipment or where early skirmishes had left wrecks. They returned with a trove, 2 intact Aegis assault rifles and spare magazines, a case of fragmentation grenades, a broken but reparable portable generator, a military-grade medical kit far superior to Dr. Ange's, and most prized of all, a ruggedized tablet containing partial schematics of Aegis's sensor equipment. Phase 2, the forge. Marlowe's workshop burned day and night. The salvaged sheet metal from the suburbs was now augmented with ballistic plating from a wrecked Aegis patrol vehicle. He and Kaito worked on not just armor, but deterrence. They rigged the generator to power a series of bright, sudden floodlights around the perimeter, tuned to a disorienting strobe. They used the sensor schematics to build simple but effective early warning tripwires that would signal not with noise, but with silent lights in the lodge. Phase 3, the garden. Under Aposila's guidance, they expanded the terraces not just for hidden foraging, but for cultivation. They planted fast-growing, hardy crops, concon, water spinach, peccary root vegetables. They built a hidden, reinforced coop for the wild chickens they managed to trap. They were no longer just surviving on scraps, they were building a yield. The war outside was a constant, grim backdrop. The distant booms of the sergeant's emplacements. The sporadic chatter of Aegis gunfire. The ground-shaking roars of the foreman's counterattacks. But in the valley, a different sound took root. The tap of hammers, the hum of the generator, the quiet talk of planting schedules. Santino's wound still ached, a reminder of his fragile biology, but the work, the purpose, seemed to keep the weakness at bay. He was bolstering the link, not just with pills, but with meaning. One evening, as they tested the new perimeter lights, bathing the valley entrance in a shocking, silent burst of daylight, Elsa stood beside him. "It's bright, Papa," she said. "It is, Nak," he said, putting a hand on her head. "We are making our own light now. So the dark things know this place is taken." They weren't naive. They knew they weren't invincible. If the sergeant consolidated total victory, it might eventually turn its cold calculus to clearing out the inefficient pocket of resistance. If the foreman somehow won and surged north, drunk on biomass, it might overrun them in a wave. But for now, they existed in the precious, stable geometry of a mutual threat. They were the small, hardened point in a triangle of giants, each giant's attention focused on the other two. The gathering storm raged at their borders, but within their fortified rock, they had done the one thing that had seemed impossible. They had stopped running. They had looked at the apocalypse and decided to build a porch, and to wait on it, armed and watchful, for whatever the new world would bring next. Chapter 17, The Harvest. The first green shoots of peccary in the fortified terraces were more than food. They were a declaration. The hum of their salvage generator was more than power, it was a heartbeat. For a few fleeting weeks, the valley they now called Sybil, Seedling, felt less like a hideout and more like a home. The war's thunder was a distant drum roll, and they were in the pocket of silence between beats. But Santino's silence was breaking. The ache in his arm had changed. It was no longer a dull burn of infection fought to a standstill. It had become a resonance. When the sergeant's biological emitter pulsed to the south, the scar tissue tingled. When the foreman's distorted broadcasts crackled over the radio, a phantom itch crawled up to his shoulder. The seed in his blood wasn't dormant, it was listening. Dr. ANJ monitored him with deepening concern. It's not activation. It's attunement. Your body is a receiver for frequencies the VA variants use. It's a side effect of your immune system's constant negotiation with the pathogen. Santino looked at his sleeping daughter, her face peaceful in the low light. What does it receive? Data, she said simply. Stress signals, coordinating pulses. Perhaps even emotional echoes. We don't know. He didn't tell her about the dreams. Visions of towering, pulsing structures of flesh and steel, and a cold, vast hunger that was not his own. A hunger for order, for efficiency, for total integration. The sergeant's dream. And in counterpoint, a fractured, brilliant, and insatiable rage, wanting to consume and become everything at once. The foreman's dream. He was a tuning fork caught between two dissonant songs. This connection was his curse. But as he watched Elsa tend her small patch of herbs, he began to see it might also be the key to her future. To secure a future, they needed to do more than hold their rock. They needed to understand the tide, so they could one day sail on it. The opportunity to learn came from a failure, Aegis's failure. Jax, monitoring their crumbling comms, reported desperation. Project Chimera is failing. The Reaper specimen they captured, it didn't just die. It dissembled at a cellular level when they tried to probe its neural cluster. Turned to acidic slurry. They lost 2 scientists. Their forward base near Subic is low on supplies, morale is shot. They're calling for a strategic withdrawal to their sea base. A dying, cornered animal with high-tech teeth. And it was between the 2 main combatants. Its collapse would spill resources, technology, and most importantly, intelligence into the landscape. We need what they have, Santino told the council. Not just guns. Their data. Their research on the virus. Their maps. If we know what they know, we stop being a rock. We become a library. And libraries get preserved, even in wars. Benjo frowned. You want to raid an Aegis base? Even a failing one? No, Santino said, tapping his throbbing arm. I want to visit the battlefield after the giants clash. We let the sergeant and the foreman finish what they started with Aegis. Then we scavenge the ruins. But to do it safely, I need to know when the clash will happen. I need to listen. The plan was the most dangerous yet. They would use Santino's attunement as an early warning system. He, along with a small, heavily armed team, would establish an observation post halfway between Sybil and the dying Aegis forward base. He would monitor the signal from the warring monarchs. When it peaked, when both biological networks focused their intent on consuming Aegis, the team would move in during the aftermath, a shadow following the tsunami. Reyes objected on tactical grounds. Kaito objected on ethical ones. But Aposila understood. The hunter knows the tiger and the leopard by their prints and their cries. If you can hear their thoughts in your blood, then that is a sense we must use. It is not corruption. It is using a thorn to dig out a deeper thorn. The night before the mission, Santino sat with Elsa. She was drawing again, a picture of their valley, but now with a tall, strong tree growing in the middle, its roots deep. Is that our tree? He asked. It's the Sybil tree, she said, not looking up. It's strong because it eats the bad soil and makes it good. He held her tight, the resonance in his arm a low thrum of dread and purpose. The observation post was a stifling hide of earth and branches. Santino lay still, his eyes closed, focusing on the pain. It was a map. The sergeant's signal was a constant, grinding pressure, like tectonic plates shifting. The foreman's was a storm of needle points, sparking and chaotic. And beneath both, a new, fading signal, the frantic, digital pulse of Aegis, calling for help that would never come. For 2 days, nothing. Then, on the third dawn, the signals changed. The sergeant's grinding pressure focused, becoming a spear point aimed directly at the Aegis base's coordinates. Almost simultaneously, the foreman's chaotic storm coalesced into a swift, sharp blade, slicing from the southwest toward the same target. The prize was too tempting, the enemy too weak. The giants were moving. It's happening, Santino whispered, his voice hoarse. Now. They watched through scopes as the world ended for Aegis Solutions. It was not a battle, it was an autopsy. The sergeant's forces hit with disciplined, overwhelming force, shattering perimeter defenses. The foreman's swarm descended in a chaotic frenzy, seeking not just destruction but acquisition. They saw snatchers hauling away crates, and even struggling, screaming men. The two viral armies clashed at the heart of the base, tearing at each other and the remaining technology in a savage orgy of consumption. Then, as suddenly as it began, it was over. The sergeant's forces, having secured the lion's share of the structural material, withdrew in good order. The foreman's swarm, laden with plunder and prisoners, retreated south. The valley around the smoldering base fell silent, littered with broken tech, shredded bodies, and the humming, dying remains of VA variants too damaged to retreat. Move, Reyes ordered. The scavenging team moved like ghosts through the carnage. It was horrific. They ignored the weapons, heading straight for the command post, a prefabricated structure now half crushed by a fallen Reaper. Inside, amidst the gore, they found it, the Aegis central server bank, backup batteries still humming. Kaido, his face pale, jacked in a portable drive and began downloading terabytes of data, research notes, satellite imagery from the early days, biochemical analyses of VA tissue, communication logs. As he worked, Santino was drawn to a different prize. In a sealed biocontainer, cracked open by a stray bullet, were vials of liquid, one blood red, one a familiar, sinister galaxy blue. The original dye stock, and a stabilized sample of the primal VA strain. The source and the evolution. A low growl echoed from outside. A wounded prowler, trapped under a beam, watched them with intelligent, hateful eyes. "Time's up," Benjo hissed. They fled, the heavy data drive in Kaido's pack worth more than all the guns in the world. As their truck bounced away from the ruins, Santino looked back. The two titans had feasted. They were stronger now, infused with human technology and knowledge. The balance had shifted. The stalemate wouldn't hold forever. That night, back in the safety of Sybil, as Kaido and Dr. A&J pored over the stolen data, Santino stood on the watchtower, his daughter beside him. The resonance in his arm was quiet, for now. "Did you get the bad soil, Papa?" Elsa asked. "We got the map of the soil and AK," he said, putting an arm around her. "Now we learn to read it. What does it say?" He looked out at the dark mountains, beyond which the digested remains of Aegis were already being incorporated into the nightmares of the new world. "It says the fight is changing, and that to secure your future, I can't just be a wall anymore." He met her eyes, the weight of his next unspoken decision already settling on him. "I might have to learn to speak the monster's language." Chapter 18, The Map in the Blood. The Aegis data lay scattered across the table in the lodge, a digital ghost of a dead corporation. Dr. A&J and Kaido had distilled its horrors into one fragile schematic, the cortical dissonance emitter. The concept was sound. The component list was a death warrant. Kaido pointed to the screen, his finger hovering over the source code for the crystalline biocircuit. Nexus Prime, Star Mall Food Court, Manila. Reyes, leaning heavily on his crutch, let out a short, sharp breath that was the soldier's version of a gut punch. "No, absolutely not. That's not a raid. That's a one-way nutrient donation." "We have to try," Kaido insisted, but his voice lacked conviction. Santino stared at the coordinates. He remembered the blue-stained mouths, the prowler dropping from the ceiling, the scratching claws. That was weeks ago, when the foreman was just establishing its rule. Now, the Star Mall would be the beating heart of its kingdom. It wouldn't be infested, it would be transformed. "He's right," Santino said, surprising everyone, including himself. The delivery driver's logic overrode the father's desperation. "We go in there now, we die. And we die for nothing." "Then the emitter is impossible," Benjo stated, a grim finality in his voice. "No," Santino said, his mind racing down a different alley. "The component is impossible for us. Right now." He tapped the screen, moving the map away from the mall to the sprawling, ruined city around it. "The foreman isn't God. It's a king. And kings need subjects, or at least test subjects." Dr. Ange's eyes widened. "You think there are still survivors in Manila?" "Not just survivors," Reyes interjected, catching Santino's drift. His tactical mind aligned with the driver's street smarts. "Holdouts." The LRR had contingency plans for urban resistance cells. Fallback points in the financial district, in the port area. If any of them held out, they'd be rats in the walls of the foreman's palace. And to a virus testing its adaptations, a persistent, clever rat is more useful than a dead one. It was a revolting, brilliant thought. The foreman wouldn't exterminate all humans in its domain. It would cultivate them, a constant source of tactical problems to solve, a live-fire training ground for its evolving variants. The ultimate proving ground. My attunement, Santino said, his hand going to his throbbing arm. It's not just a map to the monarch. It's a map to the pressure points. The places where the signal is complex, where it's tangled, where the foreman is focusing its attention. Those tangles could be where the resistance is fighting back. He was no longer talking about a heist. He was talking about a recruitment drive. The plan transformed entirely. Phase 1. Ears to the ground. Santino, Jax, the Aegis deserter who knew military comms protocols, and Reyes would set up a listening post at the old Mandaluyong Medical Center, a high-rise on the very edge of the foreman's perceived territory. Using the Aegis scanner and Santino's attunement, they would not listen for the foreman's signal, but for gaps in it, for the silent, disciplined chatter of encrypted human radios, for the telltale seismic patterns of controlled demolitions, for the thermal signatures of carefully shielded fires. Phase 2, the diplomatic run. If they found a cell, they wouldn't assault Nexus Prime. They would trade. Their currency? Knowledge. The Sybil Codex. The Aegis data on VA vulnerabilities. Their own maps of safe-ish routes through the northern provinces. In exchange, they would ask for one thing, a sample of primer tissue that the resistance had undoubtedly harvested from their own battles with high-level variants. It wouldn't be from the foreman's corps, but from a lieutenant, a reaper, a prowler alpha. It would be a weaker, less perfect crystal seed, but it might be enough. Phase 3, the bargained future. They would offer the cell something else, a future exit strategy, a place in Sybil, behind the eventual dissonance emitter shield. Not as subordinates, but as partners. They would trade immediate safety for long-term survival, merging their strengths. It was a longer shot. It required trust in strangers forged in a hell they'd only skirted. But it was the only shot that didn't end with them as biomatter in the foreman's gut. Aposila approved. The mountain does not ask the rain to stop. It finds the crevices where the water gathers and drinks from them. The listening post was a week of nerve-shredding tension. Santino's attunement was a cacophony of pain. The foreman's chaotic broadcast was a physical pressure, a headache behind the eyes. But within it, he learned to pick out patterns. A regular, localized surge of signal to the east, a patrol route. A sudden spike of complex noise near the port, followed by a wave of predatory focus from the foreman's signal and engagement. And then Jax found it, a whisper on an ultra-low-frequency military band. A repeating code, not of the fallen national government, but of the Army's Scout Ranger Regiment. A survival beacon. Its origin was triangulated to a fortified cluster of buildings near the port of Manila. "The rats of the port," Reyes said, a grim smile touching his lips. "I heard rumors. They'd be holed up in the old bonded warehouses. Concrete, limited access, sight lines to the sea. If anyone's still holding a piece of the city, it's them." Making contact was the next dance with death. They used a child's toy, a simple laser pointer, flashing Morse code from the medical center roof towards the port at pre-dawn. A day later, an answering flash. The meeting was set in a no-man's land of shattered factories. Santino went with only Reyes and Benjo, under a white flag made from a nurse's uniform. The leader of the rats was a gaunt, hawk-faced woman with the bearing of an officer and the eyes of a feral cat. Captain Ibarra. She listened to Santino's pitch, her gaze lingering on his arm, on the pain he couldn't fully hide. "You have a map in your blood," she stated. "And you have tissue from the things that put it there," Santino replied. She nodded slowly. "We do. We harvest it to study, to make better traps. We have a gland from a spitter alpha, the core of its acid synthesis. Would that serve? It wasn't the primal neural cluster from the foreman. It was a derivative, a fork in the genetic code. It would be a weaker jammer with a shorter range. But it would be real. In exchange, Captain Ibarra said, you give us all your data, and you give us a promise. When your quiet zone is ready, you extract my people. Not just the soldiers, the families, the civilians we've protected. We have a bus, Santino said. The trade was made in the shadow of the foreman's domain. A sealed biocontainer holding a pulsating, iridescent gland was exchanged for a data drive and a handshake. As they left, Captain Ibarra stopped Santino. "Your map. It's changing, isn't it? You're not just receiving. Your understanding. Santino didn't deny it. The chaos had begun to have a dreadful syntax. Be careful, driver, she said. Understanding the monster is the first step to becoming what you need to kill it, or to replacing it. The return to Sybil was triumphant and haunted. They had the key component. They had avoided a suicide mission. They had found allies. But as Dr. ANJ prepared the surgical suite to implant the spitter's gland into Santino's arm, to begin the painful process of growing their imperfect crystal, Santino felt the truth of Captain Ibarra's warning. He wasn't just borrowing a scale from the dragon. He was learning to think like one. And the future of Sybil, of Elsa, would depend on him remembering how to think like a father when the dragon's thoughts grew loud. Chapter 19. The Crucible. The surgery was a quiet, terrible thing. In the cleanest corner of the lodge, lit by the harsh glow of battery-powered LEDs, Dr. ANJ worked with the precision of a watchmaker and the resolve of a soldier. The spitter's gland, pulsating softly in its container, was a tiny, ugly thing veined with filaments that shimmered with a sickly phosphorescence. Santino lay on the table, his arm numbed by the last of their local anesthetic, his eyes fixed on the ceiling bamboo. This will hurt, Dr. ANJ said, not as a warning, but as a promise. The catalyst is designed to fuse with your tissue and use your unique biochemistry as a template. Your body will treat it like a foreign organ and attack it, even as the VA elements in your blood try to communicate with it. The pain will be the conflict. Just do it, Santino whispered. He felt the incision, then a pressure, then a cold fire as the gland was nestled against the bone of his forearm, just below his old scratch. The moment Dr. ANJ sutured the wound closed, the world changed. The low-grade radio static of his attunement spiked into a scream. It was no longer just a sensation, it was a language of pain, and he understood every word. The foreman's signal was a raging storm of want, consume, adapt, grow, consume. It was the mad inventor, the gluttonous king. The sergeant's signal was a drill sergeant's bark, hold, advance, consolidate, hold. It was the iron disciplinarian, the calculating general. And now, woven into both, a new, sharper signal, the sergeant's new detection towers. Their scanning pulses were like lighthouse beams of pure, interrogating intent, sweeping the mountains. And when one of those distant beams passed through the valley, the nascent crystal in Santino's arm rang like a tuning fork. He gasped, his back arching off the table. It wasn't just sound. It was a command, a demand for the forming crystal to identify its allegiance, to sync with the network. His own immune system, the dormant VA in his blood, and the alien gland were locked in a three-way war, with his nervous system as the battlefield. They moved him to a cot in the deepest, most insulated room of the lodge. The first 24 hours were a blur of agony and hallucination. He saw through 1,000 eyes, a prowler scaling a refinery tower in the port, a reaper methodically dismantling an abandoned howitzer, the foreman's massive, composite form brooding in the rain-lashed ruins of the mall, its countless incorporated parts writhing subtly. He felt the sergeant's cold satisfaction as another scan pulse lit up a sector of the mountains, cataloging thermal signatures. Elsa was not allowed to see him, but she sat outside the door, humming a tuneless song. When the pain crested, Santino clung to that faint sound like a lifeline, using it to remember his name. On the second day, the physical fever broke, but the mental onslaught intensified. The crystal was forming, and as it grew, it began to emit its own faint, dissonant echo, a jangling, atonal hum that disrupted his reception. Now, instead of clear, painful signals, he received broken fragments. A flash of the foreman's rage. A split second of the sergeant's tactical assessment. It was even more disorienting. The crystal is working, Kaito reported, monitoring a jury-rigged spectrometer pointed at Santino's bandaged arm. It's emitting a disruptive field in a micro-range. It's what's breaking up the signals in his head. It's also a beacon, Reyes said grimly from the doorway. He'd been studying the Aegis data on detection. That disruptive field is energy. Anomalous energy. If the sergeant's towers are looking for patterns that don't fit the natural world or the standard VA broadcast, they'll find this. Their fear was confirmed that evening. One of the mountain community's lookouts reported a change in the behavior of the filterers in the lowland lake. They had stopped their passive grazing. They were all oriented north, towards the sergeant's territory, their gill slits fluttering rapidly. They were sensing the new, scanning pulses. The environment itself was becoming aware of the search. We have to move faster, Benjo urged. Finish the emitter housing. The second that crystal is ready, we yank it out and plug it in. Marlowe and his team worked in a frenzy, integrating the scavenged Aegis components, the generator, and heavy capacitors into a protective housing. The emitter looked like a sinister, technological tree stump, bristling with heat sinks and cables. On the dawn of the third day, the crisis arrived. Santino was in a rare moment of lucidity, the pain a manageable throb, when the sergeant's scanning pulse swept through the valley again. This time, the formed crystal in his arm didn't just ring. It screamed back. A feedback shriek of dissonant energy lashed out from him, a psychic and physical recoil. In his mind's eye, he saw one of the sergeant's distant towers, a fleshy, bony structure woven with conductive filaments, suddenly spark and go dark, its precise signal fragmenting into confusion. And in that same instant, from the south, a new and different attention locked onto him. Not the sergeant's cold scan. This was a hot, pinpoint focus. A raging, curious, intelligent rage. The foreman had felt it too. It had felt a new, strange noise. A painful, interesting noise. A noise that hurt the sergeant. Santino stumbled out of his room, pale and drenched in sweat, clutching his arm. "It knows," he croaked to the startled group. The foreman, it felt the feedback. "It's interested." "How interested?" Reyes demanded. As if in answer, Aposila's grandson came running from the South Ridge lookout. Movement. On the old logging trail. Not the big one. Many small ones. Moving fast. Not running, searching. The foreman was sending scouts. Not a conquering army, but a probing finger. Drawn by the novel signal from the valley, the signal of something that could disrupt its rival. They were out of time. Dr. Anj didn't hesitate. In the main room, with the half-finished emitter humming nearby, she reopened Santino's arm. The crystal was there, nestled in inflamed tissue. It was smaller than they'd hoped, a dark, jagged geode that seemed to drink the light. It throbbed with a warmth that was not his own. Its removal was a relief and a severance. The moment it left his body, the screaming chorus in his mind cut off, leaving a ringing, hollow silence. He was deaf to the world of signals. He was just a man again, weak and bleeding. Kaido snatched the crystal, still slick with Santino's blood, and slotted it into the heart of the emitter. Marlowe threw the master switch. For a moment, nothing. Then a deep, subaudible thrum vibrated up through the floorboards. The lights flickered as the generator strained. A visible shimmer, like heat haze, distorted the air for a moment around the device before fading. "Is it working?" Benjo asked, peering out a firing slit. They didn't need technology to tell them. From the South Ridge, they heard it. The coordinated, chattering calls of the approaching prowler scouts suddenly broke into confused, isolated snarls. They heard crashing in the brush as the creatures, their pack coordination severed, blundered into each other and the trees, becoming disoriented individuals. The jammer was working. Their valley was now a bubble of silent static in the raging radio war of the New World. Santino, bandaged and exhausted, limped to the door with Elsa supporting him. He looked out at their fortified terraces, their watchtowers, their home. The physical threat was still there. The infected would still come. But they would come as animals, not as soldiers. He had done it. He had used the map in his blood to steal a piece of the monster's power and turn it into a lock for his daughter's door. But as he stood there, the hollow silence in his head felt more like a warning than a peace. He had been a beacon for a moment, and two gods had turned their eyes his way. One had been annoyed. The other had been intrigued. The lock was on the door. But outside, the dragons now knew the door was there. Chapter 20, The Quiet Forest. The change in the valley was not dramatic, but profound. It was the difference between holding your breath underwater and finally surfacing to gasp the air. The dissonance emitter did not make them invisible. Stray infected still shambled out of the treeline, drawn by the smell of life, the sound of the generator, the warmth of their fires. But they came alone, or in twos and threes, moving with the clumsy, single-minded hunger of animals. The coordinated packs, the tactical flanking maneuvers, the chillingly silent patrols of prowlers, all of that vanished. The forest around Sybil became what Aposila called Gubbit na Walang Isip, a mindless forest. They could handle mindless. For the first time since the world ended, they didn't just survive a day, they built within it. Marlowe's workshop shifted from fortifying vehicles to building irrigation channels for the expanded terraces. The children, under Rosa's supervision, started a proper school, their textbooks a mix of salvaged primers and the Sybil Codex. Dr. Anj established a real clinic. The mountain community and the lowland survivors slowly, cautiously, became one people. Santino's wound, now holding the faint, parallel scar of the crystal's removal, healed cleanly. The screaming chorus in his head was gone, but the silence it left was not empty. It was attuned silence. Like a sea captain who can feel a storm in his bones long before he sees clouds, Santino could feel shifts in the pressure of the world outside. He no longer heard the foreman's mad symphony or the sergeant's grim march. He sensed their focus. He could stand on the watchtower, close his eyes, and point to where the sergeant was pushing another scanning pulse against their bubble of static, a distant, grinding pressure like a drill trying to find a weak spot. He could feel the foreman's chaotic experiments, the hot, brief flares of new variant life that would sputter and die when their coordination failed at the edges of the quiet zone. He had become the living seismograph of the apocalypse, and with that sense came the dawning, world-altering realization the user had seen. If the gland of a spitter lieutenant could create this, what could the brain of a king do? He called a council with Captain Ibarra over the newly stabilized radio link. Her face, on the grainy tablet screen, was still etched with the grime of the port, but her eyes held a new, fierce light. "Your quiet zone works," she said, voice crackling. "We've monitored the periphery. Their coordination unravels within 500 meters of your emitter's estimated range. It's a localized miracle." "It's a prototype," Santino replied. "We used a spitter's gland, the core component. The notes from Aegis, they theorized the effect would be exponentially stronger with tissue from a directive source. A monarch." Ibarra went very still. "You're talking about a weapon, not a shield." "A key," Santino corrected. "A key that could unlock silence over a city block. A district. A way to carve out pockets of the world where we can breathe, fight, and rebuild on our own terms. Where your resistance isn't just hiding, but holding." He transmitted the full schematics of the dissonance emitter, the Sybil Codex, and the Aegis research. He gave them the blueprint, not just for a refuge, but for a future. "The sergeant is trying to burn through our static with brute signal strength," Santino explained. "The foreman is trying to design around it with new biology. They're wasting energy, innovating against a problem we created. While they're distracted with each other and with our little bubble, you can grow." Ibarra's smile was a blade. "We are not the only holdout. There are others. In the mountains of Rizal. In the tunnels of Baguio. We've heard whispers. We've been rats, surviving. This lets us be farmers. Planting quiet zones." The conversation shifted the weight on Santino's shoulders. It no longer felt like a burden. It felt like a fulcrum. In the weeks that followed, Santino's role changed. He was no longer the chief scavenger, the frontline defender. He was the valley's oracle. He would sit for hours, eyes closed, mapping the unseen war. He guided their foraging parties away from zones of heightened VA activity. He predicted when a surge of mindless wanderers might stumble their way, allowing them to set traps and ambushes. He felt the day the foreman, frustrated, diverted a significant force north to probe the sergeant's new detection network, easing the pressure on the port. He was using the map in his blood to tend his garden. One evening, he sat with Elsa on the porch of their cottage, watching the first stars pierce the twilight. The valley was alive with the sounds of their life, the clang from Marlowe's shop, the laughter of children by the spring, the low murmur of the emitter. "Is it over, Papa?" Elsa asked, leaning against him. He looked at her, at the peace in her face that he had not seen since the last normal morning, a lifetime ago. "No, Nak," he said softly. "It's not over. The storm is still out there. But we've built a very strong roof. And we've given other people the tools to build their own." He put an arm around her. "My part, the running, the fearing, the delivering, that part is over. Now we grow. And we help others grow." He was not the hero who would slay the monster. He was the man who had learned to read the monster's shadow and used that knowledge to draw a circle of light. His guilt as the vector was not erased, but it was redeemed. He had taken the poison of the new world and distilled an antidote. The story of Santino, the delivery driver, ends here, in the quiet forest he helped grow. It closes not with a bang, but with the steady, resilient hum of an emitter, and the sight of his daughter sleeping safely through the night. But the story of the VA virus, of Captain Ibarra's resistance, of the sergeant and the foreman clashing in an ever-evolving war of ideologies made flesh, that story was just beginning. And it would be written by those now holding the blueprints, the codex, and the first fragile proof that the human mind, once it stopped running, could learn to build walls even evolution couldn't easily scale. Happy New Year, and what do you think about this chapters of Santino and his family? Do you think that they would be able to build a community where they would thrive? Until next time, see you all in the next chapter, and please comment and subscribe if you like this story. Happy New Year, and this is the third of our first story for 2026. Santino's story and his struggles to give his family safety in an unforgiving world. Now overrun by a virus that he helped spread. With preparations starting, hopefully they all could escape without any problems.